It is a wonderful honor to welcome Thomas Powers in this program. He is a political science professor at Carthage College. And this hour, we are discussing his new book, American Multiculturalism and the Anti-Discrimination Regime, The Challenge to Liberal Pluralism. Tom, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here.
Let us begin. So how would you define multiculturalism and how is it different from liberal pluralism?
Yeah, that's the central question of the book. And the simple answer to the question of what multiculturalism is that it is a positive way of saying anti-discrimination, according to me. There are a lot of theories of multiculturalism that have been around now since the late 1980s, and there's a longer tradition, of course, going back to the early 20th century of liberal cultural pluralism, and you would think that those two things would be indistinguishable, but they're not. Multiculturalism comes out of the civil rights movement in the United States. There are competing theories. Kymlicka's famous theory of multiculturalism. Will Kymlicka is a political theorist from Canada, and his theory rejects American-style civil rights politics, and he has a much more ambitious view of cultural pluralism that would include things like Quebec nationalism, and even separatism and so on. So that's much more, I use the word ambitious, I don't know, or wide-ranging view of multiculturalism, but I don't think that captures what most people mean when they use the term multiculturalism, to include in Canada, by the way. I've done an amazingly detailed study of official multiculturalism policy in Canada. And according to me, again, civil rights politics, fighting discrimination, fighting racism, but also fighting sexism, homophobia, other forms of discrimination against the elderly, disabled, a wide variety of groups that we wouldn't normally put in the category of ethnic cultures. All of that is contained in the idea of multiculturalism, even in Canada. But that's a footnote. I don't really want to focus on Will Kymlicka. The main thing is to talk about civil rights. And in the United States, multicultural education is the only important source of the word multiculturalism. And that traces back to the late 1960s. It comes out of education debates that are civil rights debates about the performance of African Americans and other ethnic minorities in education. And there's a debate between the cultural difference paradigm and the cultural deprivation paradigm back in the 1960s. And cultural deprivation is something no one talks about anymore because it sounds too much like racism. And cultural difference took over. And that term cultural difference then very quickly became multiculturalism, and then multicultural education emerged, and by the mid-1970s was beginning to be policy across the United States. State and state boards of education, state laws governing teacher education institutionalized multiculturalism throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And by the 1990s, surveys of it done by multicultural education people showed that it was nationwide and authoritative and backed by law. So, we tend to think of multiculturalism as one of these words like woke or political correctness or cancel culture that somehow is this weird idea out there, but it's been policy in the United States for a long time. And what it does is express in a wide-ranging and in some ways impressively ambitious, I guess I would say, vision of civil rights politics, the morality, political psychology, new understanding of pluralism. All of that is there if you look for it. And I focus on the leading multicultural education writer, James A. Banks, in my book, to try to get his vision. He calls it a multicultural ideology, and I think we should take him seriously when he uses that term. And so multiculturalism is this new vision of democracy, ultimately, that comes out of the Civil Rights Revolution. And it's different from the liberal pluralist tradition, because the liberal pluralist tradition is rooted in the traditional constitution, the understanding of the American founders. Religious pluralism is where it begins. And so the idea of separation of church and state, individualism, toleration, voluntary associations, that whole language rooted in ideas of freedom and limited government and so on, is very old-fashioned when you compare it to multiculturalism, which is rooted in the fight against discrimination, which requires a much more aggressive, according to multicultural education and other theorists, much more aggressive, hands-on view of group politics. And so it's a very different logic. And so my reason for focusing on multiculturalism, even though that in a way dates the book back to the 1980s and 1990s when these debates emerge, is that there you can see the broad scope and scale of the civil rights revolution. You can see the ideas behind it, because I do focus in my book on law. I have a couple of chapters spelling out civil rights law, and I think that's very important. But anti-discrimination politics, or civil rights politics, is, first of all, it's a moral vision. It's also a set of powerful laws, but it's also a set of ideas. And those ideas, the most important ideas, are the ones that come out of the civil rights revolution itself. So the ideas of a new pluralism. When you have a new pluralism, that means, that's different from the older pluralism that's been around a couple hundred years. That ought to be news. Multicultural education also presents itself as a civic education. That ought to also be news. And it enshrines a set of moral values: identity, inclusion, recognition, respect, equity, social justice. Those terms are not exactly new, but they're used in a coherent, interrelated way that is new. And that even back in 1964, no one talked like that, but we do now. We take it for granted. And that comes out of the civil rights revolution. So we learn a ton by looking at multicultural education that you don't learn by just looking at the law. As important as I do think the law is, you do have to look at the law. The law teaches you an awful lot, but you can't just stop there. So multicultural education, I've had complaints from friends that multicultural education, is not intellectually impressive compared, say, to postmodernists or today. Cultural Marxism is a big deal, So they're like, why do you study James A. Banks? And the answer is, he is a pure guide back to the civil rights revolution and to the positive vision of the civil rights revolution that is adulterated. I mean, that is confused when you add postmodernism or critical race theory. Well, not critical race theory, but cultural Marxism. That kind of language really muddies the waters a lot. And so James A. Banks teaches us something that we need to know, and multiculturalism teaches something that we very much need to see. And we don't want to admit that the civil rights revolution challenges liberal democracy, the liberal democratic understanding of things, as powerfully as it does. And multiculturalism is a harsh teacher of that lesson for people who don't want to hear it. And that's people on both the left and the right.
Okay. I'm actually glad you mentioned Canada because I completed my bachelor's degree there, and I guess in my years there, I witnessed a rather large portion of how multiculturalism, as enforced in the laws as well as the study programs, can go awry. And I'm sure you're quite familiar with the name of the philosopher Charles Taylor.
Sure.
He wrote an essay, I believe, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Recognition, and that opened my eyes on a lot of things. One is that the idea of multiculturalism is connected to the idea of groups that see themselves as marginalized in Western society, claiming for a bigger chunk of representation, either legally or culturally. So, and
yeah,
Taylor would argue that liberalism or liberal pluralism, as you've argued, is not adequate with its neutrality of the laws and such. So how would you argue the case for liberal pluralism?
Well, not on Taylor's grounds. I mean, I wouldn't, I don't necessarily disagree with that characterization entirely, but I guess I would just point to other things in liberalism. But I do want to say that one thing about Taylor is similar to what's going on now with Rufo's book on cultural Marxism and the focus on Herbert Marcuse. Taylor is guilty of a similar kind of thing by muddy, because what you just described is in Taylor. It's a commonsensical appraisal of civil rights politics and the relationship between liberalism and civil rights. So that's there in Taylor. But what he adds to it is this intellectual history stuff. So he wants to tie all of this to intellectual history in a way that I find unhelpful and distracting. So I do think he's part of there's that another dimension, because he really wants to get into, Rousseau and Herder and Hegel and, all these other big names, and that confuses things in my opinion. But anyway, to get back to your question, liberalism, the advantages of liberalism are not so much in some idea of neutrality or something like that, but in the realism, the pragmatism of the liberal democratic understanding of group life. So Federalist 10, and David Hume's arguments that apparently were very influential in Madison's Federalist 10 emphasize that group politics is dangerous. Faction, the problem of faction. Now, the American founders kind of went overboard maybe with that, because they didn't make a place for political parties, for instance, in their understanding of things, which today we take for granted. But there is a lot of wisdom in their many strategies to tame what we would today call identity politics, or the politics of recognition, as Taylor, he's usefully pointing to that. Aristotle also says, all politics reduces to disputes over money or honor. So that was said a long time ago too. But the idea that group politics is very dangerous, especially ethnic politics, because it's rooted in group pride and so on, that it's not really amenable to reason. And so the strategies of the Enlightenment were all about diffusing that. So skepticism about the claims that people make, and they're talking about religion above all, right? So, but when religion is the model, skepticism is one. Separation of public and private, that's another. We don't take either of those for granted today when it comes to multiculturalism and group politics. Strategies of a moral strategy of talking about individualism and voluntary membership in groups, and saying that groups do not have authority over individuals, and that they treat one another with toleration. It's a lower standard toleration than the standard of respect that we talk about today, but toleration is achievable, where if you really think about a politics of respect, and Taylor tries to take that seriously, and I wonder that it would be another criticism I would have of Taylor, is that he never criticizes the recognition demand, the recognition claim. It's a very dumb claim, ultimately. If all you're saying is my group deserves respect, well, that is a very dubious claim for every group on the planet that makes that claim. Ultimately, it has to be proven, and it's challenged by many other claims like justice, virtue, human excellence, nobility. I mean, there are a lot of other contenders than just saying, well, this is my group, damn it, and I'm with my group. I mean, that's ultimately, and he never says that. And that is a real problem with his account of the politics of recognition. And that's where the American founders, in a way, begin. They are very suspicious of group claims, and rightly so, because they lead to all kinds of trouble. And it's a real question whether, there isn't some wisdom left in the Enlightenment understanding of group politics that we need to pay heed to.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I've read bits and pieces of Rufus's new book, America's Cultural Revolution, and I find it rather dissatisfying. I think his focus.
I saw something you wrote about that indicated that. Yeah.
Oh yes, yes. I wrote this small piece about Herbert Marcuse, and I talked to one of his students, the great philosopher Paul Gottfried, and I think Paul and I would agree that if you read Marcuse carefully, I do not believe that you would come to the same conclusion that Rufo alleges that the, I guess, DEI bureaucrats would be implementing right now. Marcuse is a very trenchant cultural critic. Of course, he's very skepticism of, I guess, liberal bourgeois society, but he says literally nothing about how non-Western, non-liberal, non-bourgeois society is somehow the better alternative. So I guess you're welcome to add to that.
Yeah, and I was wondering, Catherine McKinnon actually is a very famous lawyer, who helped launch harassment as a concept of anti-discrimination law. And I was wondering, was she influenced? Because my big beef with Rufo is that he has this causal claim he's trying to push, that Marcuse is the mastermind of wokeness, right? And he has some evidence which is interesting, actually. But he has to ignore so much. So I went and I looked at Catherine McKinnon. She mentions Marcuse twice, once each in her books, to criticize him for ignoring feminism, basically. And so Marcuse, like many other Marxists, was trying to come to terms and figure out civil rights. It's there if you look for it here and there. He mentions things that are in the ballpark of civil rights, but basically, civil rights is a challenge to Marxism because Marxism is all about economic class. And this is why neo-Marxists turn to Gramsci, because Gramsci gives you a much more flexible notion of, hegemony is no longer just economic. And so that's why Gramsci's more attractive to folks on the left today, because it allows them to come to terms with the civil rights revolution. Rufo mentions two critical pedagogy theorists, and I have a chapter on postmodernist multiculturalism in my book, and so I'm familiar with these two guys, McLaren and Giroux. And they are out and out postmodernists. That's how they identify themselves, and they're students of Freire's, but they also are breaking with Marxism. And they, at one point, even kind of say, well, we've sort of talked Freire into our position, which is breaking with Marxism as much as, and that's a problem for them. I'm not saying they're not at all Marxists. They're ex-Marxists, or they long for the days when Marxism somehow worked or whatever, So they're torn by it, but it is a real problem because they want to talk about sexism, racism, homophobia, and it's very hard to get to that from a straight Marxist point of view. And that's much more fundamental for these folks than Marxism itself is. So today, the focus of conservatives on cultural Marxism, race Marxism, and so, Thomas Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, as his co-author, wrote a really useful book a couple books on postmodernism and multiculturalism and anti-discrimination that I found useful. Like, they're nice surveys. And then Lindsay, just a couple years later, changed his tune entirely and said, now he wrote a book called Race Marxism. He's got another book out about that now, about education. I forget what it's called. And it's odd to me. I don't know. I mean, it's a very simple explanation is available where you just say, everybody hates Marxism and we beat Marxism once before. Therefore, let's focus on Marxism, call this thing wokeness or whatever it is by Marxism. And then we've already won. And that's not just an error. That is very dubious from a political point of view, because it allows your followers and yourselves to be misled about what it is you're actually facing. And if you start with multicultural education, if you start with James A. Banks back in the 1960s and 1970s, you would never come to that conclusion. You would see from the start, he was always articulating the vision of things that comes out of the civil rights revolution. And that means that all these radical ideas that are in our lives today and on the headlines in our schools, in woke capitalism and so on, that's been around for 50 or 60 years, growing and taking hold of our minds and our hearts. And that is the truth. And that's much harder to face. And so they don't face it, it seems to me. It does seem to me of an evasion to talk about Marxism. It's just bizarre. Anyway.
Yes. I believe in that essay of mine about Marcuse, I specifically name Rufo as well as James Lindsay. I assume that's whom you mean.
Is it James Lindsay? Sorry.
Yes, James Lindsay.
Maybe it's like James T. Lindsay. Anyway, I apologize. Thank you for the correction.
You're welcome. So I specifically critique them on their, I guess, their inclusion of Marx as the be-all and end-all of everything that's wrong with American academia and society. And again, not to defend Marx in any way, but if you read him closely, I don't think you would come up with multiculturalism and DEI and woke politics, which brings me to
Can I just say one thing there? Can I say one thing there? Just
please.
Because I've been reading a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of other people who have been making this argument about Marcuse, and so I've been looking into it and and then at first I was just like, oh, this is wrong and needs to be refuted. I've actually been in touch with Paul Gottfried myself about this, and he's more sympathetic to this claim than I am, I think.
Yeah.
But at least in the case of Rufo, he's impressed by the evidence that Rufo has. But it does occur to me that if you see Marcuse as a kind of analogy for what is going on, then there are things that you can draw from someone like Marcuse to say it helps us think about where we are today. This call for a radical transformation of our political life using subtle means that are out of the way not so visible, infiltrating our institutions and so on. I mean, that does describe what happened. I do think it's very, very bad as a causal explanation to say that, Marcuse was some kind of mastermind, and what has happened is that people secretly were following Marcuse, wittingly or unwittingly. I think that's totally wrong. But there are some ways in which, like the Ruffo interpretation, I don't want to go too far criticizing it, because I do think there's some value in that line of thinking, but you have to be very careful. I was reading some stuff from the 90s, actually, where people were making the same argument, and they were not making a causal claim, at least not as clearly. And I think what happened is that argument has bounced around in the last 25 years and gotten just grown anyway. Sorry, that was another footnote there. You started to ask a different question.
Yes. I was thinking that the text that came out during the 90s in regards to, race and culture and how to deal with both issues are more relevant today than the texts from the 60s. So
Yeah.
I'm going to name like two texts that I can think of. One is The End of Racism by Dinesh D'Souza. It's quite amazing how overlooked that book is.
I agree.
Compared to how controversial that book was at the time it's released. It's a very large book, and it's an interesting book. There are some pretty hair-raising statements in there, but overall, the book is interesting. D'Souza, I believe, blames the doctrine of cultural relativism on the programs that you and I are disagreeing with, multiculturalism and the anti-discrimination regime.
Well, I have to be careful how far we disagree with the anti-discrimination regime.
Of course, yes.
You and I both obey anti-discrimination law, and I'm sure, based on things I've watched some of your podcasts, so I think I can say safely that you certainly agree with the basic premises of anti-discrimination law.
Mm-hmm. I think D'Souza would go pretty far in in removing certain anti-discrimination laws. But
at points it sounds like it. At other points I wonder. But yes, okay. Go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off there. I just had to be careful.
But
I don't want to end up. Well, never mind. I'm not gonna. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I think if
So the one book you mentioned was The End of Racism, and you said there was another book.
The other is We're All Multiculturalists Now by Nathan Glazer, but I would like to focus on the D'Souza book first.
Sure. Sure.
He points to everything that's mistaken, so to speak, about the liberal approach to anti-racism, I guess multiculturalism and anti-discrimination laws, to that doctrine of cultural relativism, the idea that you cannot critique a culture because by doing so you are projecting a standard and you're projecting a certain sense of moral superiority. I think that's where multiculturalism, the doctrine, can come in. But D'Souza believes that if we follow multiculturalism to its logical limits, it can create more conflict than it can solve, because there are certain fundamental axioms of, I suppose, Western culture that is incompatible with, say, Islamic culture. So,
oh, sure. Yeah. Well, nobody's really serious about multiculturalism taken literally. I'd say that universally. That is a universal truth right there about multiculturalism.
Okay.
Like you say, but you want me to respond, or were you done? I didn't want to.
So just one more thing.
Yeah.
So I think he argues for a multiracial society, which I think you and I can be sympathetic with, but not a multicultural society. So my question now is, well, if we stop adhering to the multicultural doctrine, how can we be certain that in a multiracial and multicultural society, each culture can feel respected and represented?
Nobody, as I said before, no one takes multiculturalism or cultural pluralism literally seriously. No one takes it, because no one would say, because that would mean immediately anti-discrimination wanted to say, well, of course we want the KKK around also. No one wants that, right? So we don't really believe any culture is fine. And so, yeah, so that would be the first thing that I would say. And that's always been true. If you go back to cultural pluralism is an older liberal version of this argument. Forrest Kalin invented, I don't know, 1915 or something like that, a long time ago. No one really is serious about saying that fascism or Islamic theocracy or, Stalinist communism is equal or something. No, because, and there's a confusion there about politics and culture that just gets glossed over in the term itself. So I think that's the first thing you have to say about multiculturalism. You just have to dismiss the actual literal meaning of the term and look at what people who advocate it are actually calling for. And then when you look at James A. Banks, he's very explicit. What multiculturalism means is the fight against discrimination, racism, sexism. It's impossible to think of sex as a culture, really. I'm sorry, or gender or whatever. It's not, men, culture, women. No one really, maybe someone has made that argument, but no one really takes that seriously. My issue with D'Souza's claim that cultural relativism is the core of everything. I mean, he was extending an argument made by Alan Bloom in The Closing of the American Mind, which was published, not quite a decade earlier. And in a way that Bloom did not. Bloom did not try to say that this explains civil rights. And D'Souza actually does literally say the civil rights movement is a product of cultural relativism. And I do think that's a mistake. And it's interesting that today no one really makes that argument anymore. One thing he doesn't mention, which is also fascinating, because I was looking over the book recently, he never talks about postmodernism. Now, he wrote his book in 1995, and that was, right around the time postmodernism was sort of breaking ground in the United States. He did a speaking tour, debate tour with Stanley Fish. He writes about Fish. He mentions other postmodernist authors in his book, and he does wrestle with cultural relativism. But later, a few years after this, people were saying, oh, multiculturalism is just postmodernism. Like today, they're calling it cultural Marxism. But one thing that D'Souza does do, and where he traces the influence of cultural relativism, is back to social science. So here, too, you have another attempt to explain the civil rights revolution, not by the civil rights revolution itself, but by reference to something outside, some intellectual force, because then you can blame social science, you can blame cultural anthropology, you can blame an idea like cultural relativism, and you don't have to face quite as squarely the civil rights revolution itself. Although, as you point out, D'Souza is willing to go pretty far down the road of facing the civil rights revolution itself, up to a point anyway. At moments, there are places where he calls into question the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but at other points, he seems to be taking it back. So he's a little bit cagey on that issue. Yeah, so I don't think, I think it's interesting to see somebody today. We would, I think, kind of find that odd to say that anybody would think the civil rights revolution is cultural relativism or multiculturalism. I guess it's more plausible because the word multiculturalism sounds kind of strange and we don't know what it means. And it seems to be akin to cultural relativism. But the truth is, even in the quotations that are in D'Souza's book, what's being called for is cultural equality. And that's true of Taylor, by the way, his book. So it's not cultural relativism. It's a moral claim about the equality of cultures. And that's very different from relativism, actually. On its face. And so that D'Souza didn't see that, I don't know, there is a lot to be impressed by in D'Souza's book. Above all, the breadth of his reading. That guy read everything. It took me a long time to write my book. I read a lot of stuff, but I'm flipping through this, and he certainly knew he was all over multicultural education too. I didn't realize that. I read this book a long time ago, and I've been going through some stuff from the 90s lately to just for my own purposes, partly because of the Marcuse stuff, but anyway, yeah. So I do think there's a lot of value. I think Rufo should go read The End of Racism. He would learn a lot. And he would hear a lot about civil rights. That's one thing that was really striking. D'Souza is talking about Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Derek Bell, all these people that Rufo talks about, that come out of critical race theory. They're the founders of critical race theory. But for D'Souza, they're just civil rights lawyers. They're on the left side. They are interpreting civil rights law from the left, and he finds that alarming, what they say, but that's all he understands it to be. He's not trying to say it's something else. So that's another place where D'Souza's book is very valuable, it seems to me.
Mhm. Of course, the second book that I mentioned, We Are All Multiculturalists Now by Nathan Glazer. I'm afraid I'm not that familiar with that book as I did with D'Souza.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can, I guess, explain or summarize.
Yeah, no, I mean, Glazer was actually on my dissertation committee, and
Oh,
I think I convinced him that there were some limitations in that book. He never said otherwise, and certainly I mean, I wasn't, attacking him or something like that, but I mean, we disagreed on a couple basic things. The main one being that he says explicitly in that book that multiculturalism does not come from the civil rights revolution, or that's not what it represents. And that was central to my dissertation back in 1999. Is when I defended, so it was a long time ago. Yeah, no, I mean, my whole dissertation was to prove the opposite. So not because of his book, really, but everything by Glazer is very valuable. I would say one thing that threw Glazer off, which is something that I don't know how important it is today, but it for a long time was a big factor in conservative thinking. And now Glazer's not that far to the right, but on affirmative action, he was. And the way that folks on the right or center right or even center left look at affirmative action is to make a decision. Hugh Davis Graham, most famous historian of the civil rights era, he makes a distinction between anti-discrimination, which he says is liberal, and affirmative action. That's where he draws a line, a breaking point. And so in my dissertation, I was saying, no, that's not right. Affirmative action is, yeah, it's out there, but anti-discrimination itself, if you understand its basic commitments, and multicultural education helps you see that, then you see, no, the fight against discrimination, once it's launched into the private sector in this aggressive way, it's armed with all these powerful moral arguments, these very ambitious psychological projects to, refigure everybody's identity so that they're no longer racist and so on. I mean, it's just impossible to see that as liberal anymore. And none of that has anything to do with affirmative action. But conservatives were always in this position where they were saying anti-discrimination is fine. Our enemy is affirmative action. I published an article in 2001 that made this my argument about anti-discrimination. It wasn't so much about multiculturalism. And I was not allowed to use, in the public interest, I was not allowed to use the term anti-discrimination in my title. I wanted to be from anti-discrimination, from liberal democracy to anti-discrimination democracy. They would not let me put that in the title. It was too radical sounding for them. And instead, it was this transformation of liberalism from 1964 to 2001, which actually obscures very much the argument I tried to make. But I was a junior scholar at the time. I had no choice but to let the editors own that title. Glazer, like many conservatives, thought, no, affirmative action, yeah, that's not liberal. But of course, anti-discrimination is liberal. So he's reading multicultural education, guys, and he was very familiar with all these people. And he's like, these people are not liberal. I don't know what they are. So he's trying to figure it out in these various ways. And he just didn't see that right in front of him was the anti-discrimination revolution as it was being articulated by people who are in the middle of it, who are really pushing for it. Another little minor thing about Glazer is he says that in the United States, multiculturalism, the idea of multiculturalism comes from Canada. Our neighbor to the north is what he says. And that's just wrong. That's not true. They come out about the same time. Trudeau, I think it was 1970. Well, I don't remember. I don't remember Trudeau's. I'm embarrassed to say I don't. You may know as a Canadian, or you went to school in Canada, so you might actually remember when the Trudeau multiculturalism policy launched. But anyway, they were roughly contemporaneous and independent of one another. One came out of an education debate in the United States, and in Canada it came out of the question of Quebec and how to deal with biculturalism, breaking with biculturalism. So totally different origins, but the Canada story is quite interesting because at first it wasn't about civil rights. And then in the 90s, the policy was being abused so powerfully in Canada, it looked like it might have to go away. And then the bureaucrats running it realized, no, if we package it as anti-racism, nobody will touch it. And that's what happened. And ever since the early 90s, there was a big policy review of Canadian multiculturalism. And ever since then, it's been anti-racism. In fact, recently, I'm out of date with, I'm going to go get to this soon. In the Trudeau years, multiculturalism actually came under attack from the point of view of anti-discrimination because it's too focused on racism and it doesn't focus enough on homophobia, I guess. I think that's the issue. So it's funny. It's like, it's the center of that whole story really is civil rights and anti-discrimination. I believe that's correct. But anyway.
Mhm. Yeah. The way I hear about it is, I think one of the catalysts to launch his multiculturalism policy is a way to sort of keep Quebec in the Union. I think in the 70s, there was a huge movement for.
Well, it was actually quite insulting to Quebec because the old policy was biculturalism.
Yeah.
And that meant that Quebec and English Canada were roughly equal. And then the Ukrainians didn't like that. And so they said, no, we want multiculturalism. And Trudeau, who was not a fan of Quebec separatism, embraced the idea of multiculturalism, and Quebecers, as I understand it, were not happy with this. I think that's pretty well understood. And also, then Quebecers have never had a multiculturalism policy. They call theirs interculturalism, which I don't think is required of the French language. Is the word multiculturalism, but I believe it was just so that they didn't have to buy into the federal multiculturalism policy. I believe that's right. My dissertation supervisor, H. Donald Forbes, is a great expert on Canadian multiculturalism. So I am indebted to him for most of my insights about some of this early history of multicultural education.
Wonderful. I should check out his work.
Yeah, he's got a great book, which I reviewed. I can send you the link. H. Donald Forbes, a book on multiculturalism.
Okay, wonderful. I look forward to reading it.
You have him on your podcast.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Only
so you mentioned critical race theory, and one of the fascinating scholars of that particular field, I think, is Derek Bell. And Bell is one of those people that were active in the civil rights movement. I believe he led the charge against segregation that would culminate in the Brown decision in the Supreme Court. And he would be a lawyer for some years. He may have been clerking under Thurgood Marshall, from what I've heard. But after the 1960s, he became disillusioned. He believed that the promise of the civil rights movement have not been fulfilled. And I wonder if the present day anti-discrimination regime, to what extent it was inspired by the disillusion of Bell and I guess his cohorts.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the difficulties of clarifying the debate that there are so many people. I would just say there's a left interpretation and a conservative interpretation of civil rights in America. And so a lot of people say, oh, no, people like Bell or Kimberly Crenshaw or Iris Marion Young is a political theorist, and they say things that reject anti-discrimination law. But what they're doing is and so it sounds like they must be postmodernists. They must be something outside of civil rights altogether. They're not. They're leftists who are disappointed with the failures, in their view, of civil rights, and they want a more aggressive alternative. But they are still absolutely products of the fight against discrimination. In their view, the fight against discrimination is not strong enough. And so they want more aggressive policies in most cases. And so that muddies the waters again, because people look at that and they think, oh, they're not for civil rights, they're for something else. They must be for Black separatism or postmodernism or Marxism, because they disavow civil rights, but they disavow it only in the name of a stronger version of anti-discrimination. I make that point in my book about Kimberly Crenshaw and Iris Marion Young explicitly. I'm going to write something about intersectionality that is the same issue. And so, how influential have they been? Well, I guess I would say that certainly the left interpretation of civil rights has been very successful, but always contested, right? So affirmative action, if you look at the affirmative action debate, in a way, the Supreme Court just ruled against an important pillar of the affirmative action laws in the United States when it comes to diversity as a compelling governmental interest, in the logic of the law. But right now, affirmative action is the policy of the federal government, of all, many state and local governments. It's the policy of the private sector. Pervasively, it's supported by federal funding, contract compliance rules and so on. There is a massive web of policies that support affirmative action in the United States that would take a very long time to dismantle. I don't think the Supreme Court's going to be able to do it on its own. It would require congressional action. And right now, there's certainly not the political force to do that. Also, there's this thing called disparate impact, which is like this parallel universe in the law that is not affirmative action, but is the logic of affirmative action. It's saying that when I see an inequality, that is discrimination under the law. And it turns out that is law. That is part of anti-discrimination law. And that is the vision of the left. They want to say anywhere where we see group inequality, we need to do something about it. It is the centerpiece of the Biden administration civil rights policy. It's an equity initiative. He has created equity agency teams in every department of the federal government right now. This has happened in the last couple of years. So that's a huge fact. So that's one piece of it. Now, that's just the affirmative action disparate impact piece. If you look at, and this is what I focus on in my book, I actually think we get misled if we look just at affirmative action. But if you look at the idea of harassment, stereotypes, those are expansions of what discrimination is that were incredibly important, because hostile environment harassment governs our social interactions. And there are consequences. People get fired for that without due process and so on. And corporate liability changed in the 1990s in such a way that corporations and other institutions like universities and any other social institution that oversees people has become the monitor. So enforcement of all this has become privatized. And those changes are very hard to capture in one term. I talk about it in my book as the expansions of what Shep Melnick calls the civil rights state, which has become much more punitive, much more invasive, much more pedantic. Diversity training is not separated from the law. It's ultimately a product of the law. And so all of that is the left interpretation of civil rights as well. Catherine McKinnon, I don't know, not Derek Bell per se, because he's focused more on race, but harassment in particular, and an aggressive view of that idea, which, just a little story there. Harassment originally in the Supreme Court decisions in 1986 and I think 1993 or 1995, I forget, Harris versus forklift systems. In those cases, the Supreme Court was very clear. Look, hostile environment does not mean just offensive statements. But a few years later, the EEOC was saying, harassment equals offensive statements. And so it covers such a wide range of phenomena, all the way from sexual assault at one end, that's in the ballpark of harassment, to merely offensive statements. And so that is a radical change in how our social interactions are governed. And again, that's the left interpretation of civil rights. And that's an area where conservatives don't really know what to do, don't know how to talk about it, don't understand the law, in my opinion. They're all over affirmative action. They've been all over affirmative action ever since the 1960s, even, certainly since the 70s. But these other aspects of the law that govern our thinking, our speech, there are many laws that restrict free speech that are civil rights laws. And all of that we haven't quite thematized. Christopher Caldwell's book is an important turning point there. There were other lawyers who were making the same case before his book, but his book is very important in that respect, and try to turn our attention to those questions, even though he has a lot to say about affirmative action as well. Mm-hmm. So I guess I just say to sum up, Derek Bell and other folks who represent the left interpretation of civil rights, they're never satisfied. That's true today. There are sociologists who write about this stuff, and they're very interesting to read on the left, and they're never satisfied. Diversity training doesn't work. What can we do to make it work better? What can we replace it with? How can we get more aggressive? That's always the theme But when you read the same material from the right or from the center, you're like, wow, we have done a lot in this country to change. There's a wonderful term, social technology, sort of the term that political scientists used back in the late 70s or in the 80s, I guess it was. Reiner Knopf wrote a wonderful book about social technology, and that's what civil rights law is doing. He saw that early on.
Now, I understand that 2 weeks ago, or roughly 2 weeks ago, was Martin Luther King Jr. Day. I believe this year is the 15th of January. And I believe ever since 2020, at least, every MLK Day since have been kind of a rather tepid, I suppose, custody battle over what Martin Luther King Jr. mean and meant. You know,
Aha.
you know how conservatives would focus on his "I have a dream" speech and uh, "I have a dream that my children shall not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character."
Sure.
Progressives and radicals, I'm thinking people like Cornel West would point to his democratic socialist economic policies and his protests against Vietnam. And right now, with the war going on in Israel, there are Jews who would point to his friendship with Rabbi Heschel as an example of Black Jewish friendship that has sadly been deteriorated.
Yeah.
I suppose this is both, I suppose, an easy and difficult question. What do you believe Martin Luther King Jr. mean?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't be able to do better than, in a way, restate what you just said, that people on the left and right interpret him as they see fit, and they can find in him things that point in both directions. I do think, I guess what I would say, and to be honest, I thought about writing about Martin Luther King instead of, James A. Banks. He's not a household name. And so that is a difficulty with my book, I guess. I don't think it's a problem with my book. It seems to me, we need to come to terms with the fact that somebody like James A. Banks really does articulate something very central to our political life today. But I looked at King, and I was struck by things that were extraneous, like the Vietnam War. That was not. There were connections to civil rights there, or to the war on poverty, or to nonviolence. Those are issues that were important at the moment. But what he does say things that point in both directions on affirmative action. There are things that he said that point to both against and in favor of affirmative action. So you could try to use him for that. But and I think this is the most important thing. Martin Luther King, like everybody else in the 1960s, did not see what was coming. Hubert Humphrey, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King, no civil rights activists saw what the civil rights regime was going to create. No one would have thought, harassments, the idea that sexual stereotypes would be banned by law. Oh, that didn't happen until 1989, or at least the Supreme Court didn't, give its seal of approval until 1989. It took a long time for a lot of these developments to emerge. And so what got launched was this massive undertaking that the people who launched did not understand. And we are the products of it. And I would say we don't understand it either. That's why we talk about wokeness or cultural Marxism, all these other, a lot of people want to say it's a new religion. It's this, that's Gottfried, by the way. I'm going to write something to respond to him about that, because I have an answer now. Finally, I've been thinking about this. It's not a religion. It's morality that comes out of politics, and Americans don't know how to think about politics and morality. The closing chapters of my book are all about that, about politics and morality, and that is the center of the civil rights revolution. It's something that liberalism tried to suppress. We tried to say legislating morality, that's dangerous. Let's reduce politics to interests and rights are moral, but they're a kind of tamed moral claim. And the civil rights revolution has reintroduced this dimension. You could say it's the normal dimension of political life, moralized politics, and it's a powder keg. And we don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to deal with it because we don't have the tools, because the only tools we have are from the liberal tradition, which hide the role of politics and morality in life, and try to say everything's about liberty and limited government and toleration, not justice. We don't know how to talk about justice very easily. And so, Martin Luther King, I think, was like these other figures. They saw the necessity of taking bold action to stop discrimination. And, at the time, it was just an overwhelming historical necessity. And today, I think everyone who could get elected in the United States would say, yes, the Civil Rights Revolution was necessary. The treatment of blacks was outrageous, could not be tolerated. And so something had to be done. And it couldn't just happen in the public sector. It had to happen in the private sector as well. Because if you allowed private sector discrimination to continue, you were going to basically allow segregation as a whole to continue. And so, we had to do what we did. But in doing so, we unleashed something we don't understand. And so what I've been trying to figure out now, and I've been thinking about since my book is out finally, is how do we talk about confronting that? How do we talk about reforming civil rights? Because I do think that's the project. We have to start seeing that and admitting to ourselves that the Civil Rights Revolution was not perfect. We take it very seriously. It's at the heart of our understanding of democracy today. I think if you ask people which is more important, liberty or fighting discrimination, most people would not have an easy time answering that question, and for good reasons. But there have been problems associated with the Civil Rights Revolution, and we need to have a more honest way of confronting that. And that's not going to be easy. No one talks that way. Caldwell does, a few other people do. But for the most part, it's cultural Marxism. Let's talk about, Marxism. That's easy to talk about. Or even, critical race theory, or even the phrase DEI now. Everybody hates DEI because we know that that's just bad. But, what's the connection of that to the Civil Rights Revolution? Well, it turns out it's a very profound connection to diversity training and the offices that were required, by the law, basically, ultimately. But if we have a label like DEI and we see it in some extreme example that looks nutty, it's easy to dismiss and we don't have to take it seriously. But that needs to change, especially conservatives are going to have to address that, or they're just going to continue to lose, culture, this culture war that we're having.
Mhm. Now, I'd like to end on this note. I think if you're a Harvard student in the 2023-24 year, I think you must be having a terrible time, given the reputational hit and that that institution has been taking. First was the students for fair admission case in the Supreme Court, and secondly is the hearing regarding anti-Semitism on campus and how the dismissal of its president, Professor Gay. But I think the focus on what's going on in Harvard and the Ivy League may be a bit distracting, because even though they are the premier learning institutions of American life, not many people occupy that space. They still are very selective colleges. And it is true that the academicians and administrators and even students occupying that area do not are far removed, so to speak, from American life. Nevertheless, do you believe that what is happening to Harvard and other universities may put a dent in the affirmative action, anti-discrimination legal regime?
I think it's way too early to tell. I have been following pretty closely Governor DeSantis, Christopher Rufo, and these various conservative pushbacks, and I'm part of that in a way. I mean, I disagree with various dimensions of it maybe, but I am struck by the fact that what has happened so far is conservatives attack mode, right? So they're just going after weak links. So they've gone after critical race theory. They go after this vague thing called DEI. They go after cultural Marxism. They've taken over a couple of universities, Florida, one university so far, and they've done a few things where they can act immediately, but no one is talking about civil rights reform. Nobody. DeSantis never talks about civil rights reform. No one confronts it, names it adequately, because then you pay too big a price politically, right? So we go after the things on the margins. And Claudine Gay, yeah, she said some very foolish things, and the students are, saying outrageous things in some of these protests. And so those are easy targets. And that's where conservatives have attacked. There's no long-term strategy. I've been asking around. I've been talking to other conservatives and say we need a civic education project to teach people about the civil rights revolution. No one is interested in that project, as far as I can tell, because it's too long-term. Who wants to do something that's going to take 20 or 30 years to bear fruit? And talking about changing the guts of, I just published something recently on the Ellerth-Faragher test. Have you ever heard of the Ellerth-Faragher test, by the way?
Me.
Yes? No? I don't know. But anyway, no one has heard of it. It's very important legal change in liability and so on. And you would really need to get into the guts of harassment law and some of these other measures where the enforcement was handed over to the private sector and start to tinker with that, change it so that the logic were different. And people are fighting on the affirmative action front, and there are some things that are happening, but there's no broad consensus. And again, at the level of general naming of what the issue is, I do think that conservatives simply are not facing the issue. So this could be the beginning of something. DeSantis and Ramaswamy also both, early on anyway, Ramaswamy was mainly about fighting discrimination. And so you had two presidential, about the fight against wokeness, rather. And so you had two presidential candidates committed to fighting wokeness. And that's an interesting fact. That's news, right? And Donald Trump does, in a way, represent that at some level. And, his actions as president when he was in office earlier do reflect that as well. So this is a new fact, but the broad meaning of it for the long haul, it seems to me, is unclear. The fight over civil rights, over affirmative action, has been going on forever. And I would say that the left won that so far. And the commitment to fighting discrimination in America has only gotten stronger at the level of the culture, at the level of popular opinion. If you look at young people today, so I would say that generally speaking, it's not obvious that conservative pushback is going to succeed. And so the victories that the right has, because they have identified some weaknesses, some of the extreme points on the left, just because they've had those successes, does not at all indicate to me that that conservatives are about to win. Certainly not anytime soon. This could be the beginning, though, of a broad cultural pushback and rethinking of the civil rights revolution. And I think that's what we need. I know that's not a happy thought, because we are committed, and for good reasons, to the legacy of Martin Luther King, the civil rights revolution. That was an important moment in American history. But things were introduced to our political life that were troubling, and we need to face that, and we need to think about it. And then the liberal democratic tradition, the tradition of the American founders and so on, it does have a lot to offer us. It does have a lot to teach us still. So there is hope there.
Yes, I'd like to end with this. I understand one of the key voices immediately after the civil rights movement, who has voiced some of the doubts about the new, I guess, legal regime, I think it's the historian C. Vann Woodward. He's very significant in his criticisms of what has become of the university sphere and affirmative action and everything. But I guess, unfortunately, aside from, I guess, myself and a few others, he's not that well read anymore. And I think that's a shame. I think more people should read C. Vann Woodward. He's just such a remarkable historian.
Yeah, the history of the civil rights revolution. I don't write a lot about the history of it. I think especially the chapter 2 of my book does cover the history, the legal history primarily, and then chapter 3 also covers some of the legal history since then. And I'm more interested in the civil rights revolution since the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, because that's where the expansions of the Civil Rights Revolution are most clear. So the earlier years, I'm less. I mean, Hugh Davis Graham is the book that I, and other works of civil rights historians are I looked at when I was, learning about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But that's my focus.
I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Thomas Powers,
Okay.
for joining the program.
Thank you very much.